Hey guys, welcome to Red Sun Stories. Hope you're doing well. Tonight, we follow Amaterasu Omikami, the goddess of the sun herself, into the cave where she hid and plunged all of creation into darkness, and the extraordinary moment the world worked together to bring her back. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what time it is for you. I would love to connect with you guys. Now, let's dive into tonight's story together. Before the darkness came, there was a sound like the sky itself being torn in two. It began in the rice paddies of the heavens, in the high plain called Takamagahara, where the fields stretched golden and endless under the light of the sun goddess. The grain had grown thick that season, heavy on its stalks, the color of late afternoon honey. The channels between the paddies ran clear and cold with mountain water, and the land was so full of peace that even the wind seemed to hold its breath so as not to disturb a single stalk. Herons stood at the edges of the water channels on one leg, unmoving, as patient as everything in that place was patient. The gods moved through Takamagahara at their various speeds, some quick as insects, and some slow as clouds, and the world above the world went about its business with the unhurried confidence of a place that has always existed and expects to go on existing forever. It was Susanoo who broke that peace. He came roaring down from the sky like a storm that had lost its reason, and everything he touched turned to ruin. His hair streamed behind him like black clouds unraveling, and his voice crashed against the celestial mountains with a force that sent avalanches of starlight tumbling into the valleys below. The rice paddies of Takamagahara, those perfect ordered rows of grain that his sister Amaterasu had tended with such infinite care, he attacked with the systematic thoroughness of a man who does not know how to grieve and is destroying things instead. He filled the channels between the paddies with stones and packed earth until the water had nowhere to go and began to back up, spreading dark and still over the roots of the grain. And the grain that had stood tall began to lean, and the color that had been honey began to go gray at the edges. He tore down the low divisions between the fields that had taken years to build. He trampled through the grain in his passing, his footsteps crushing wide paths through what had been perfect rows, and behind him the broken stalks lay flat against the wet earth, and the smell of crushed green things rose into the air. When the damage had been done, he laughed. But it was not the laugh of someone enjoying themselves. It was the laugh of someone who had given up on something they could not name. And Amaterasu had watched this from the place where she lived, at the center of all light, where the sky was warmest and the view extended in every direction over the whole of creation. She had watched her brother in his grief for a long time, for she knew, even then, that grief was what it was. Susanoo had wept for their mother Izanami so long and so hard that his tears had stripped the mountains bare and turned the rivers dry where they passed through his domain. He had wept until the gods themselves came to beg him to stop, until the earth had cracked from the weight of his mourning, until the sound of his crying had become indistinguishable from the sound of storms. And now, expelled from his realm by their father Izanagi, who could no longer bear the endless weeping that was destroying everything it touched, Susanoo had come to say goodbye to his sister before his long exile began. But goodbyes, when they come from people in the deepest kind of pain, do not always look like goodbyes. She had armed herself, had Amaterasu. She had seen him coming, and she had been afraid. Not of her brother, but of what her brother had become in his grief, of the force he was carrying inside him that had no shape yet and no direction except outward, destructive, spending itself on whatever stood in its path. She met him at the borders of Takamagahara, with her bow drawn and her arrows rattling at her hip, her eyes wide and watchful. She had worn her armor over her robes, had chewed her sacred jewels, and breathed out a line of warrior gods to stand at her sides. She was the sun. She did not turn away. But the damage was done nonetheless. The weaving maiden died when Susanoo, in his wildness, threw the flayed body of a horse through the roof of the sacred weaving hall, startling the young woman at her loom so badly that she fell upon her own shuttle. The hall that had always been full of the steady, rhythmic sound of weaving suddenly went wrong. The sound of the girl's cry was the last sound of the ordinary world, the last moment before everything tilted, because when Amaterasu heard that cry, when she ran to the hall and understood what had happened, when she saw the woman she had gathered around her lying still, something in her that had always been turned outward toward the world turned inward instead, all at once and completely. She walked to the cave. It was called Ama no Iwato, the cave of the sky rock, and it sat at the place where Takamagahara felt oldest, where the cliffs rose in colors of deep winter, and the silence had a weight to it, like snow that has accumulated over many years. The path to it was not long, but it felt long, in the way that paths to certain places always feel long, as if the distance is being measured in something other than steps. She walked it without hurrying and without looking back, and the light she carried went with her, and Takamagahara grew dimmer with every step she took. She walked into that darkness, and she pulled the great stone door shut behind her, and the sound it made when it sealed was a sound like a heartbeat stopping. The sun went out. Not gradually, not with the slow amber fade of an ordinary sunset. One moment the light was everywhere, woven into the sky, breathing off the water, that caught in the grain of wood and the iridescence of feathers and the faces of the gods going about their work. And then it was gone. The darkness that followed was not like night. Night has gradations, has the silver of stars and the cold glow of the moon, has the blue-black depth that your eyes adjust to, until shapes emerge from it, like memories. This darkness had none of that. It was complete. It was the darkness of a world that had lost its source, not just its manifestation. In the fields, the grain stopped growing. Along the rivers, the water turned slow and cold and strange, moving without its usual brightness, making none of the sounds it usually made. Animals that had never known fear began to stand very still and tremble. Birds that had always known which way was east turned in confused circles and cried out in voices that had never made those sounds before. In every corner of creation, something old and reliable went out, and the world was left holding itself together by habit alone, waiting for something it could not name to return. And the evil spirits, those who had always lurked at the margins of things, who had lived in the cracks between the light and pressed themselves flat against the dark side of leaves, pressed forward now into the space the light had left. They grew bold. They moved into the center of things, into the rice paddies and the village squares and the open roads, and they laughed in a way that had nothing joyful in it at all. Voices rose in the darkness of Takamagahara, not screams, not yet, but the uncertain murmuring of 8 million gods trying to find one another in the sudden black, calling out like people separated in a fog, reaching for hands they could not see. The voices overlapped and tangled and rose until the darkness was full of sound, which was in its own way another kind of darkness, because all that noise and none of it doing anything, none of it bringing back the light. The gods came to the cave. They came from every corner of the heavens and the earth, the gods and spirits of all living things, pressing toward Ama no Iwato as if proximity to the problem was itself a form of working on it. They came because there was nowhere else to go, because the sun goddess was behind that stone, and the world was coming apart without her, and because sometimes when something is lost, you go toward the last place it was seen, and you stand there. There was Omoikane, the god of wisdom, whose thoughts moved slower than most, but deeper than any, who sat in the darkness and considered everything before he spoke. There was Futodama, who knew the old rites, the correct forms, the words that had been used since before words were common. There were gods, whose names had been sung since before the first island rose from the sea, before anything had learned how to begin. They gathered outside the cave, and for a long time they were quiet. The darkness pressed against them from all sides. In the world below, the evil spirits had grown bolder still. Strange lights that were not fire drifted over the rice paddies. The weeping of people who did not understand what had happened drifted upward and reached into Takamagahara, and the sound of it was different from the weeping of gods, smaller, more bewildered, the weeping of creatures who had built their entire understanding of existence around the daily return of light, and now found themselves in a world where that return was no longer guaranteed. Omoikane sat in the darkness and thought. He thought about grief and what it does to a person. He thought about the difference between grief that spends itself outward, as Suzanu's had, and grief that turns inward and seals itself away. Both kinds destroy things, but in different ways and on different timescales. Suzanu's grief had been visible, terrible, and finite, a storm that raged and passed. Amaterasu's grief was invisible and quiet and had no edges that anyone could see. You could push back against a storm. You could not push back against a sealed stone door. You could not argue a person out of a cave. You could not demand the light return. You could not command the sun to rise. Omoikane thought about what it would take to reach someone who had withdrawn completely, who had sealed themselves in darkness and showed no sign of curiosity about the world they had left behind. He thought about what kind of thing travels through stone. Not argument. Stone stops. Argument. Not pleading. Stone is indifferent to pleading. Not the formal petitions of the old rites, though those had their place. Something that travels through stone without needing to. Something that creates its own passage by being itself. And the answer came to him slowly, the way his answers always came, and when it was fully formed, he rose and went among the gathered gods and told them what he was thinking. For a long time there was silence of a different quality, people considering an unusual idea. And then the gods began to move in the darkness with new purpose. They gathered the roosters first. The long crowing roosters of Takamagahara, whose voices carried farther than ordinary bird voices, trained for generations to announce the dawn regardless of circumstances. They gathered them and set them before the cave, and the birds opened their beaks and crowed into the stone, their voices layering into a declaration of mourning that had no mourning behind it. But the stone did not move. The birds crowed until their voices took on a quality of uncertainty, until even they seemed to be asking whether this was working. And then they fell silent. Then they brought the great mirror. Yata no Kagami, the 8-span mirror fashioned from celestial metals, was carried carefully through the dark and hung in a sacred sakaki tree that grew near the cave mouth. Blue and white offerings were hung from the tree's branches, and Futodama recited the great liturgy in his careful, formal voice, the old words that had never failed. the Norito that predated the grief and the storm and the darkness that came from the time before any of this had happened. The words filled the air around the cave mouth and settled into the stone, and still the stone did not move. And then Ame no Uzume climbed atop an overturned tub and let the night carry her away. She was not the most powerful of the gods gathered there. She did not have the measured depth of Omoi Kane or the precise authority of Futodama. What she had was something different and harder to catalog, a quality of complete presence, of the body given over entirely to the present moment without reservation, of the self that knows how to disappear into what is happening right now. She was the goddess of dawn, of threshold moments, of the exact transition between one state and another. She lived in the in-between places. She began to dance. She danced with her eyes half open and her arms moving in patterns that suggested things older than the gods watching her, older than the gods' names for things. She danced the way a fire moves in wind, not fighting the force, but becoming it, bending and recovering in the same continuous motion, present in every position without fixing in any. She danced, and as she danced, she began to pull aside her robes, baring her shoulders to the dark, and the act was neither scandalous nor serious, but something else entirely, joyful and strange, and completely sincere all at once, a person giving themselves over to joy in the face of absolute darkness, because joy was what the situation required, even if the situation seemed to argue against it. The gods watched. Something happened. One of them laughed. It was surprised out of them, a short sound, involuntary, the kind that comes before you have time to decide whether laughing is appropriate. But laughter, once started, is one of the least controllable forces in existence. It moved from God to God, the way warmth moves through still water, touching one and then the next, spreading outward in widening rings, each god igniting from the god beside them, until all 8 million were laughing together in the darkness outside the sealed cave of the sky rock. Their voices joined in a sound so enormous and so warm that it seemed impossible the darkness could hold it, seemed impossible that the stone could stop it. The laughter continued. It rolled and built and came back on itself and grew again. It was not the polite laughter of ceremony, or the measured laughter of those who are conscious of being observed. It was the laughter of people who have been very afraid and are suddenly no longer afraid, who have been holding something tight and have suddenly let it go. It was the laughter of 8 million gods standing together in the dark, laughing because Ame no Uzume was ridiculous and sublime and completely committed to what she was doing, because the sight of her had done something to the darkness that argument and petition and the crowing of roosters had not been able to do. Inside the cave, Amaterasu heard it. She had been sitting in the dark she had made, wrapped in the silence she had chosen, in the absolute stillness of a grief that has gone all the way down to where there is nothing beneath it. She had been sitting with the memory of the weaving hall, and the sound of the girl's cry, and the weight of what her brother had done, and the darkness had felt appropriate to all of it, had felt like the only honest response to a world that had shown her what it could do to something she loved. What she had expected to hear through the stone, if she had expected anything, was argument or petition. The gods asking her to come out, listing reasons, be applying the formal pressure of divine will and ritual requirement. Or perhaps silence, the world learning to manage without her, which would have been its own kind of answer. She had not prepared for laughter. The sound traveled through the stone the way warmth travels through metal. Slowly, persistently, indifferent to the resistance of what it was moving through. It was not one voice, It was not something that could be mentally sorted and categorized and set aside. It was the joined voice of 8 million, and it carried in it something that grief in its sealed state has no defense against, which was the suggestion that the world was continuing, that things were happening out there, that she did not know what was going on, and the not knowing was, suddenly, something other than irrelevant. She stood. She moved to the cave mouth. She placed her hand against the great stone and pushed, the smallest fraction, not opening, not committing to anything, just the beginning of wondering. And through that fraction of movement, a thread of her own light escaped. A single thread of gold, thin as spider silk, warm as a palm against the cheek. The smallest possible amount of sunrise. Tajikarao had been waiting. The god of strength had been standing beside the cave door since before the gathering, patient as a mountain, because Omikami had asked him to wait, and Tajikarao understood waiting the way certain things understand what they were made for. He had positioned himself correctly, had assessed the weight of the stone, had made himself ready without making himself obvious. He was very still. He was very ready. And when the thread of gold appeared, when the crack opened the width of a thought, he took hold of the stone with both hands and pulled. For a moment, the whole of creation held its breath. The stone moved, and Amaterasu stepped out of the cave. When Amaterasu stepped from the cave, the heavens wept with something that was not quite sorrow, a flooding of feeling that has no precise name, that comes when something you had feared was lost returns to you, when the thing you had arranged yourself to live without is suddenly there again, and you do not know yet how to be with it. The light came back, not gradually, but all at once, as if it had been waiting just beyond the cave mouth, gathered and ready, and the gods on either side of the entrance held a rope of light between them to frame her return. A gesture of formal welcome that was also a gesture of love. The evil spirits fled. They went back to their edges and their cracks and their marginal places with the speed of things that know they have been indulged past their time. In the world below, every rice paddy woke. The grain that had been holding perfectly still in the dark began to lean toward the warmth in the slow, inevitable way of growing things. The rivers ran clear. The birds found east. The animals stilled. Amaterasu stood at the threshold and looked at what had happened to the world in her absence. And she looked at the 8 million gods who had stood outside her cave in the dark and laughed. And she felt something that she did not have a precise name for either. But that was related to the thing the gods had felt when she stepped out, which was the quality of understanding that comes from being on the outside of something you did not choose. She let the light go. She gave it back to the world without measuring, without the usual careful proportioning. It poured over Takamagahara and ran down into the human world and spread over the sea and the mountains. And everywhere it reached, things woke up in stages, blinking, adjusting, coming back to themselves with the particular combination of relief and confusion that comes from waking after a very long sleep. The fisherman who had been standing on the shore staring into absolute darkness suddenly saw the water again, saw its movement, its particular dark green nearness, the white line of foam where it reached the sand. They stood for a long moment simply looking at the water they had always known, seeing it as if for the first time, before they remembered that they had nets to check and boats to bail, and the ordinary business of their days to return to. The farmers in the paddies felt the warmth arrive on their backs and turn toward it, faces upward, standing among the ruined and the still living grain alike. breathing in the warm air that tasted of all the ordinary things, wet earth and green growth and the distant sweetness of flowering trees somewhere uphill. The things that had been absent for so long, they had forgotten they were absent, and were now present again, and somehow more present than they had ever been before. The elders in the villages sat very still when the light returned. They had lived long enough to know that things which seem permanent are not always permanent, and the darkness had confirmed this knowledge in a way they had not anticipated. They sat in the new light and let it warm them, and some of them wept, not from grief, but from the opposite of grief, from the feeling that has no name that rises in old people when something they feared was over turns out not to be over, when the world that has held them for so many years announces that it intends to keep holding them a while longer. The children ran out of the houses. The children who had been kept inside during the darkness, kept close by parents made afraid, ran out into the sudden light with a wildness of joy that had no thought in it at all, that was only the body expressing everything it had been holding during the dark hours. They ran through the paddies and along the shore and up the paths toward the hills, and their voices carried over the water and up into the mountains, small, clear sounds of pure pleasure, the most ordinary sounds in the world and the most remarkable. The herons came back to the water channels. They came back from wherever herons go when the world goes wrong, and they settled back into their customary positions at the edges of the channels with the dignity of beings who had simply been elsewhere and have now returned without explanation. They stood on one leg in the shallow water and looked at the reflections of themselves with the deep, unsurprisable calm of herons, and the world looked at them and understood that the world was, once again, the kind of place where herons stood in water channels looking at themselves. Then there was the matter of Susanoo. He came before the assembly without argument, without the storm energy that had characterized his grief, without weeping or rage. He came quietly, which said everything that needed to be said. The storm had spent itself. What stood before the gathered gods was a being emptied of everything except the willingness to face what he had done. They stripped him of his beard and his fingernails, the marks of divine authority in the heavenly realm. They spoke the words of judgment with sorrow rather than anger, because they understood grief and did not confuse it with the damage it had caused. And then they sent him down into the world below, out of Takamagahara, into the long wandering life of the earth. He went without looking back. Amaterasu watched him go, and what she felt was not simple. It had the quality of all complicated feelings, grief and understanding braided together, a love for someone who had hurt her, the knowledge that the world was large enough for both of them, even if it was not large enough for both of them to stay in the same place. She turned back to the sky. The days that followed were ordinary days, which is to say, they were extraordinary. The first days after a darkness are always extraordinary in their ordinariness. The sun rises, and it is exactly the same sun it has always been, and it is not at all the same sun. The rice paddies received the light with an attentiveness that had not been there before the darkness, the way that people listen more carefully to voices they have been afraid of losing. The rivers ran with a clarity that seemed somehow more conscious than their usual clarity, more deliberate in their brightness. The gods returned to their places and went back to their work, and but slowly, with frequent pauses, turning their faces toward the light in the way of people who have remembered how much they depend on something they had taken for granted. Omikami catalogued everything. He sat in the place where his thinking happened, and he went through all of it, the darkness and the gathering and the roosters and the mirror and the dance and the laughter, and he extracted from it the principle that sat at the center of all of it, like a stone sits at the center of a peach. He did not write it down. He carried it. Amino Uzume went back to her threshold places, the dawns and the dusks and the in-between moments when one state is becoming another. She was different. She had danced in absolute darkness, and the darkness had cracked. Not because she was powerful, and not because she had done the correct thing in the correct form, but because she had given herself over entirely to joy when there was no external reason to be joyful, and the world had turned on that decision. She carried this understanding in her body the way you carry things you have learned through your body, not as a thought, but as a way of moving. And Amaterasu went back to the sky. She rose the next morning as she had always risen, moved across the face of the heavens as she had always moved. But she rose now from the other side of the knowledge of what it meant to withdraw, of what it meant to the world when the light went away. And that knowledge changed the texture of her rising, if not its shape. She rose and she moved and she set. And the world received her, as it had always received her, with the unconscious gratitude of things that need what she offers and have stopped noticing that they are receiving it. Except on certain mornings. On certain mornings, when the light came back with a warmth that exceeded what the ordinary business of sunrise required, when it had in it something that was not just heat, but something more personal, something that felt like a choice being made. On those mornings, the people in the rice paddies below would stop what they were doing and lift their faces. They did not know why. They had no story yet to explain the feeling. They only knew that on those mornings the light felt different, felt like something being given rather than something that simply was, and the feeling of receiving it was the feeling of being noticed by something much larger than yourself. The seasons turned. Spring came with its particular rains, soft and persistent, falling at an angle that suggested patience rather than urgency. Rain that had all the time in the world and intended to use it. The paddies filled with water that reflected the sky back at itself in trembling silver, and the young rice shoots stood up through that silver in rows as orderly and purposeful as an army that intends only to grow. The frogs began their singing in the damp margins of things, in the drainage channels and the flooded corners and the shallow edges of ponds, that ancient sound, unreformed by any century, indifferent to all the things that had happened and would happen and were happening right now. The sound of frogs at night near water is one of the sounds that tells the world it is still itself, still operating. He's still honoring the agreements it has always honored with the living things that depend on it. The plum trees bloomed before anything else bloomed, the way they always do, impatient, unwilling to wait for the weather to be entirely certain, producing their small white flowers in the cold of late winter when the ground is still frozen in the mornings and the light is still thin. The plum flowers fell and were followed by the cherry flowers, which fell in turn, and the falling of the cherry flowers is itself one of the most ordinary miracles. The way the petals release all at once when the wind is right, filling the air with soft white movement, each petal turning slowly in the air, taking its time arriving at the ground, unhurried in its ending. Summer came and settled over everything the way summer does. Not violently, not all at once, but through a series of days that were each slightly warmer than the last, until suddenly the heat was complete and had clearly always been there, waiting to be arrived at. The rice grew tall, the stalks thickening toward the abundance of harvest, the heads of grain filling out and beginning to bend with their own weight, the fields going from the upright green of growth to the heavy gold of completion. the cicadas took up their enormous noise in the trees, that sound which is simultaneously one of the most ordinary sounds in the world and one of the most ancient, a sound that seems to come from the trees themselves rather than from anything living in them, a sound that belongs to heat, the way silence belongs to cold. The evenings of summer in Takamagahara were long and liquid, the sky going through its colors with a slowness that seemed designed to be watched. Orange into rose into the color that has no name that sits between rose and the first blue of night, and then that blue deepening by degrees, pulling the orange and rose down toward the horizon and holding them there briefly before releasing them entirely until the stars came out and the world of day was put away and the world of night arranged itself in its different register. Autumn arrived without announcing itself, the way it always arrives. Gradually, through the changing angle of light, the light becoming more horizontal and therefore more golden, reaching into places that summer's high sun could not reach, illuminating the undersides of leaves and the faces of cliffs and the surface of water in longer, more considered strokes. The air cooled at night first, then cooled in the mornings, then held its coolness a little longer each day. The rice was harvested, the paddies emptied, the great bundles of grain carried in from the fields by people moving in groups. The harvest work being one of the kinds of work that has always been done together, because it is too large for any one person and because it is a good occasion for being together. The maples turned. They turned in stages, one tree ahead of its neighbor, a hillside going through its colors from top to bottom over the course of 2 weeks, from green through the colors of fire to the brown of completion. And each stage was perfect in its own way, and the brown of completion is also a kind of beauty, the beauty of things that have finished doing what they were made to do and have no anxiety about having finished. Winter closed the year quietly. The snow came in the mountains first, as snow always comes. At night, silently, transforming the landscape in the dark so that people woke to a world that was the same world they had always lived in and was completely other than it had been the night before. The paddies that had been harvested and left bare were filled with snow and became white and flat and geometrically pure, and the mountains behind them were white, and the sky above them was the cold gray white of winter sky, and the whole world was simplified into forms and shapes with all the usual colors removed, which is its own kind of beauty, the beauty of reduction, of the world showing its underlying structure. Through all of this, Amaterasu moved. Through the summer's long evenings and the autumn's golden afternoons and the winter's spare cold light, the light that is not warm but is bright, that says, "Here I am," working even in the cold. She moved across the sky. She rose and she moved, and she set and she rose again. And the rhythm of it was the oldest rhythm in the world of Takamagahara, the beat under everything, the pulse that the seasons and the tides and the migrations of birds were all variations on. The cave of Amano-Iwado stood as it had always stood, the rock face dark and cold in the old part of the world, where the cliffs rose in the colors of deep winter. The great stone that had sealed the cave mouth had been moved aside by Tajikarao and left where he had left it, not put away, not returned to its former position, just moved, sitting in the shallow valley near the cave like a thing that has finished its work and has no further instructions. Moss grew on its sides. Water pooled in its crevices after rain. It became, over time, part of the landscape in the way that all things become part of the landscape if they stand still long enough. The cave was open. It was empty. The darkness inside it was the ordinary darkness of caves, which is not sinister or heavy, but simply the absence of outside light, the interior quiet of stone that has been stone for a very long time. In the mornings, if you stood at the right angle, the first light of Amaterasu's rising would reach into the cave mouth a short distance and illuminate the inner walls, the gray and brown of old rock, the occasional glint of mineral in the stone. The sakaki tree still stood near the cave, and the great mirror had been moved to a more permanent home. It would eventually become one of the 3 sacred treasures of the imperial line, carried and honored through all the centuries that came after. But the sakaki tree remained, and in certain seasons it bore small dark berries that the birds came for, and the birds' movements in the tree disturbed the silence in the way that living things disturb silence, not breaking it, but inhabiting it, proving that silence is not emptiness, but something with room in it. The story settled into the world the way that certain things settle, not suddenly, not completely, but gradually, finding its level, becoming part of the substrate. It was told in villages along the coast, where the people had felt the darkness most acutely and the return of light most intensely. It was told in the mountain passes, in the long quiet evenings of winter when there was time for long stories. It traveled and changed and took on the colors of the places it passed through, and some details were lost and some were added, and the version that survived the longest was never quite the same as the version that had happened, but the feeling inside it remained accurate. That was what traveled through all the versions of the story, through all the centuries of telling and retelling. Not the specific details of Tajikarao's grip on the stone, or the exact words of Futadama's liturgy, but the feeling at the center of it. The feeling of darkness that seemed complete. The feeling of laughter where no laughter seemed possible. The feeling of a crack of light appearing in what had appeared to be solid stone. That feeling is not limited to the story. That is why the story lives. Outside the cave, the valley breathes. The valley outside Ama-no-Iwato has always breathed. The movement of air through the valley is its breathing. The slow exchange of warm air and cool air, the way the temperature drops as evening comes and the light goes, and the valley holds the day's warmth inside itself like a sleeping person holds warmth inside blankets. The breathing of the valley is slower than any person's breathing, slower even than the breathing of someone in the deepest sleep, and it has been going on for much longer than any person has been going on. The valley breathes in. The valley breathes out. It has been doing this since before the first person stood in the valley and noticed that the air was moving. It will be doing this after the last person has left. The breathing continues regardless. The way the important things continue regardless. Steady, unremarkable in its steadiness. Profound precisely because it requires nothing from you. Proceeds with or without your attention, sustains itself. Listen to the valley breathe. The rice paddies are silver in the early evening, when the sky above them has gone from gold to the pale color of bones, and they hold that silver with the perfect flatness of a mirror. You can see the clouds reflected in the flooded paddies, moving across the reflected sky in the opposite direction from the real sky. And if you watch long enough, the distinction between the sky above and the sky below begins to soften, begins to feel less absolute than it seemed at first. The roosters sleep. The roosters that had stood before the sealed cave and crowed into the stone until their voices went uncertain, have gone back to their roosts in the ordinary way of roosters, settled into the peculiar rigid sleep of birds, and they will wake tomorrow and crow at the arriving light with the same uncomplicated confidence they have always had, because roosters do not remember what they remember. Each morning is the first morning. Each morning is always the first morning. Ami no Uzumi stands at her threshold as she has stood at every threshold since time began, 1 foot in the dark and 1 foot in the coming light. She is very still. She is not dancing now. The dancing is for a specific kind of moment, and this moment is not that moment. This moment is the other kind, the waiting kind, the moment of pure potential before anything has been decided. She waits without impatience because impatience requires a preference for the future over the present, and she lives entirely in the present, in the exact moment of standing at the threshold with the dark on one side and the not yet light on the other. The moment will come when it comes. The mountains at the edge of Takamagahara stand in their positions with the ease of things that have been in their positions for so long that they no longer need to hold themselves there. They are simply there. The darkness and the light that move over them do not change them. The seasons that come and go do not change them. They receive everything that passes over them with the same unchanged presence. The summer thunder, the winter silence, the long rains of spring, in the perfect still days of autumn when the air is so clear you could reach out and touch the edge of the sky. Breathe the way the mountains breathe. Long and slow and barely perceptible. The kind of breathing that is not effort, but simply existence. The baseline function of a thing that is alive in the way that very old and very still things are alive. Not obviously, not demonstrably, but undeniably, in a way that you would feel immediately if it stopped. The sakaki tree near the cave turns in the night wind. Its small, dark berries catch what light there is. Starlight, the faint, cold glow that the sky has even on the darkest nights. And each berry holds its point of light the way a bead of water holds light, round and complete. The tree moves, and the light in the berries moves. And the effect is of the whole tree being gently luminous, as if it is keeping a private fire, small enough to hold in your cupped hands. The gods are in their places. The god of rivers is in the rivers, running with them through the mountains, through the valleys, through the flat alluvial plains where the water spreads and slows and finally gives itself over to the sea. The god of the sea receives everything the rivers bring, the soil from the mountains, the minerals from the rock, the warmth from the sun-heated surfaces, and holds it all in one immense moving body, in constant conversation with the moon, rising and falling in the tidal rhythm that is one of the oldest rhythms in the world, older than the rice paddies, older than the herons, older than anything that has learned to measure time against it. The god of sleep moves quietly through all of this. The god of sleep has no fixed position because sleep is not a fixed thing. Sleep moves through the world with the shadow of the earth, following the night, visiting each place in turn, offering what it offers without obligation, without demand, only available, only present, only ready to receive those who are ready to be received. The god of sleep is the most patient of all the gods because sleep cannot be hurried. Sleep that is hurried becomes something other than sleep. It becomes resting with effort, waiting with vigilance, lying down while the mind keeps walking. Real sleep, the sleep that restores, that processes, that allows the machinery of the body and the mind to tend to themselves in the quiet. Real sleep comes only when it is allowed, only when the allowance is genuine, only when what was held is actually set down. Set it down. Whatever has been carried into this night, set it down here, in this story, in the valley outside Amanoi Wato, where the gods have already taken their places and the cave is open and the great stone sits harmlessly in the shallow valley where Tajikarao left it. Set it down the way you would set down a heavy pack at the end of a long walk, with the particular relief of the body noticing what it was holding only in the moment of no longer holding it. The night is long enough. The night has always been long enough. Every night that has come has been long enough for what needed to happen in it. For the grain to rest, for the rivers to run their dark courses, for the animals to sleep and wake and sleep again in the patterns their bodies know, and for the stars to complete their portion of the great turning. Every night that has come has been exactly as long as it needed to be, and this night is no different, is also exactly long enough, and you are inside it, held inside it, the way the grain is held inside the dark hours, surrounded, protected, given what you need by the fact of the surrounding alone. All 8 million of them are in their places, in the positions they hold in the structure of the world, doing what they do, which is mostly what the world requires and what they are suited to without effort. The god of rivers holds the rivers in their courses. The god of rain holds the rain in readiness for its season. The god of sleep, and there is a god of sleep, as there is a god of everything necessary, holds the sleep of the world in both hands with tremendous care. Because sleep is one of the fragile things, one of the things that undoes itself if you hold it too tightly. Let the god of sleep hold yours. Let the care that has been keeping you going be held by something larger for a while, the way you hand something heavy to a strong person when your arms have been tired for a long time, and you have just noticed how tired they are. The heaviness does not go away. The strong person does not make it disappear. They simply carry it for now so that your arms can rest, and your arms rest, and the relief of resting after a long time of carrying is its own complete thing. The world below Takamagahara is quiet. The villages along the coast have banked their fires for the night, and the smoke from the banked fires rises in thin columns that barely disturb the air. They barely leave a trace of themselves before they dissolve into the dark above the rooftops. The fishing boats that were pulled up on the beach are still on the beach, their bellies against the sand, resting the way boats rest, completely, without effort, without the tension of movement. The sea is quiet too, in the particular way that large bodies of water are quiet when there is no wind to trouble them, moving in long, low swells that do not break so much as lean against the shore with the gentlest possible pressure and then draw back. The sound of the sea has no edges. The sound of the sea at night when the wind is quiet is a continuous sound, a sound with no beginning and no end that you can identify, a sound that does not ask anything of you except to be in the presence of it. It comes from every direction at once, from the water and from the shore, where the water meets the shore, and from the air above the water, and it fills the ears in the way that certain kinds of complete quiet fill the ears, not by being absent, but by being so complete that you stop noticing it, and it becomes the texture of the silence itself. The rice paddies inland from the coast are silver under the stars. The stars in the sky above Takamagahara have been doing what they always do, which is to say, they have been doing nothing except being themselves. Enormous, distant, burning with a cold consistency that has nothing to do with what happens in the world below them, caring nothing for darkness or light, or the grief of storm gods, or the hiding of sun goddesses. They were there when the cave door sealed, and they were there when it opened, and they burned through both events with the same impartial brightness, and they are burning now. Look up at them. Look at the way they are arranged in their patterns, the patterns that the gods recognized and named and used to navigate long before the first boat was built or the first road was walked, the patterns that the birds know in their bones, the patterns that repeat themselves exactly every year and have done so since before there was anyone to notice them. The great turning of the stars is the oldest clock, the one that was running before anyone had a word for time. Let it run. Let it run the way it has always run, without your assistance, without your attention, without anything from you at all. The stars will do what they do. The sky will turn. The world will move through its night toward its morning. And the morning will come not because anyone arranged it, but because the arrangement has been in place since before the arrangement was an arrangement, since before the world knew it was the world. Amaterasu is resting now. Even the sun goddess rests. Even the light that has illuminated everything since the beginning of the everything needs the hours of dark to be what it is, to build up the warmth and the brightness that it pours out each morning with such apparent abundance, the light that seems inexhaustible and would be exhaustible if it were not replenished in the dark. The dark is the preparation for the light, the way sleep is the preparation for the day. They are not opposites. They are one thing expressed in two ways. You know this already. You have always known it. Your body knows it even when your mind forgets, knows that the darkening is not a loss but a preparation, that the going quiet is not an ending but a gathering, that the stillness of right now is not emptiness but fullness of a different kind, the fullness of rest, of readying, of the deep and necessary return to the source of things. In the cave of Ama no Iwato, the darkness is very still. The cave is empty, and the darkness in it is the simple, honest darkness of a cave that has no light in it, nothing more. The cave is not a frightening place. It was never a frightening place. It was a place of retreat, and retreat is not always failure. Sometimes retreat is the body's intelligence asserting itself over the will's stubbornness, the knowledge that what is needed is not more engagement, but less, on not more light directed outward, but the temporary gathering of light inward, the drawing in that precedes a fuller giving out. The cave offered what the grief needed, and then the world offered what was needed next, and then Amaterasu offered herself back to the world. And this is the shape that things take when they are working properly. The need, the retreat, the finding of what is needed in the dark, the readiness that readiness alone can produce, and then the return. And the return is always richer than the original departure because of what happened in between. You carry your own version of this pattern. You carry it in the rhythm of your breathing, in the rhythm of your sleeping and waking, in every moment of difficulty that has eventually resolved, and every rest that has followed effort. The pattern is yours. It has always been yours. The story of Amaterasu is the story of this pattern, given the size of the sky and the sun, and the 8 million gods. Given the scale it deserves, the cosmic scale that matches the feeling of it, the feeling of having been in the dark and having come back out into the light. But if you stood at the cave mouth in the first moment of morning, in the exact moment before the sun goddess crests the far mountains and begins her daily passage, you would feel it, the held breath of the world at the edge of its exhale, the moment of total stillness before the light begins, the darkness at its most complete and most transparent, pressed thin by the approaching warmth. That moment passes very quickly. It always passes very quickly. Breathe in. Feel the edges of your body, where your body meets the air, in the boundary where what is you becomes what is everything else, a boundary more permeable than it seems. On your exhale, that boundary softens slightly. Let it soften. The air that is inside you and the air that is outside you are the same air, the warmth that is inside you, the warmth your body makes and maintains, the consistent interior temperature that you carry everywhere without thinking about it. That warmth meets the air at your skin and gives some of itself to the air, and the air takes it and carries it away. And the warmth is not diminished by the giving. The body makes more. The body is very good at this. The body has been doing this since before you had a word for any of it. Since before the first cold night required the first fire, out since the beginning of the long relationship between the warmth of living things and the cold of the world that contains them. Your body is doing it now. Your heart is moving the warmth from the center outward, from the deep interior through the vessels to the surfaces, to the skin, to the air. It does this approximately 60 times per minute, has been doing this every minute of every hour of every day since before you were born, will do it through this night and tomorrow and the night after, without requiring your attention or your supervision or your gratitude, though gratitude is available if you want to offer it. The heart beats, the breath moves, the warmth circulates. This is what is happening right now, in the quiet, underneath the story, underneath the thinking, underneath everything you have carried into this night. In these three things, the beating, the breathing, the circulation of warmth, are happening. They have been happening. They will continue. You are being sustained. You have always been being sustained. Rest in that. The world outside the cave is very large. The world outside the cave contains all 8 million gods in their places. The roosters dreaming of morning, the sakaki tree with its small luminous berries, the mountains receiving the night, the valley breathing its slow breath, the sea moving against the coast without urgency, the people in their villages held in their sleep like berries in the cupped hand of the god of sleep. The world outside the cave is enormous and continuous and full of the quiet business of everything being what it is without effort. And the cave is very quiet, and the stone that sealed the cave is long since moved, and the grief that sealed itself inside the cave walked out into the light a very long time ago. The path back is always open. Ame no Uzume stands at her threshold, very still, watching. The darkness on her left, the coming light on her right. The moment she is waiting for has been coming since the beginning, has always been coming, and will always be coming. And the waiting for it is not anxious, but peaceful. Because a thing that is certainly coming does not require anxiety, only patience, and the willingness to be present when it arrives. Be present. The light will come. The light always comes. It comes now, and it has come before, and it will come again. And this is not a hopeful statement, but a factual one, the most factual statement that can be made about the world, and are truer than anything else that can be said. That the light comes, that after the cave there is the open sky, that after the sealed stone there is Tajikarau's hands on the stone, that after the darkness the 8 million voices, and after the 8 million voices, the laughter, and after the laughter, the curiosity, and after the curiosity, the crack of gold. The crack of gold, thin as a spider's silk, warm as a hand against the cheek. The rice paddies of Takamagahara stretch in every direction, silver and still, waiting for morning the way they always wait for morning, without impatience, without doubt, simply waiting, because they know what morning is, and they know it is coming, and they have learned through all the long history of their existence that the best thing to do with certainty is to rest inside it. Rest inside it. The world is holding you the way the earth holds everything that rests on it, without effort, without preference, with the simple structural fact of being there. You do not have to hold yourself. You have never had to hold yourself. The world has been holding you since before you were born. will hold you through this night and into the morning, has held you through every night you have ever lived without you needing to ask. Let go of the holding. The darkness is ordinary. The darkness is preparation. The sun will rise. She always rises. She rose this morning. She will rise tomorrow. She is resting now, the way everything necessary rests, in the dark hours before its return, gathering what it will give. And you are resting now. In the valley outside Amano-Iwato, when the bamboo grows in the low places where the water runs off the cliff face and sinks into the soil, the bamboo has always grown there. It was growing there when the cave sealed and growing when it opened, and it has been growing steadily through every year since. It grows without consulting anyone, without permission, without announcement, pushing up through the soil each spring with the patient confidence of a thing that knows its place in the order of things and does not question it. Bamboo grows faster than almost anything else. In the height of the growing season, it can add a handspan of height in a single day. And if you sat beside a shoot and watched it for an entire day, you would not see it move. The growth happens in increments too small for the eye to catch, and yet at the end of the day, it is measurably different from what it was at the beginning, having accomplished a great deal through the simple mechanism of continuous, unhurried work. The work of restoration is happening in you in the same way tonight. In increments too small to perceive, in the cells and vessels and spaces between thoughts, in the deep interior where the body tends to itself, without witness, you will not feel it happening. You will wake having been changed by it. The wind moves through the bamboo. The bamboo moves with the wind. The sound it makes is the sound it has always made. That hollow, resonant clacking. That whispered approximation of language. That voice that seems on the edge of saying something and never quite says it. And it is possible that what it is always on the edge of saying is the same thing the story of Amaterasu says, the same thing that the sound of the sea says, the same thing that the long, slow breathing of mountains says, if you can be still enough and quiet enough and patient enough to hear it. It is not urgent. It says itself at the pace that things that have always been true say themselves, unhurried, repeated, available for as long as you are listening, there when you wake and there when you sleep. The night continues. The night is not a container with walls. The night is a state, a quality, a mode of being that the world moves through between one day and the next. And you are moving through it now. You have been moving through it. And the movement is not work. It is the kind of movement that requires only that you allow it, that you not resist the moving. You are being carried. You have always been carried. The resistance to being carried is the only effort involved. Release the resistance. The herons on the water channel do not resist the darkness. They fold themselves into it, tuck their heads under the architecture of their own wings, and become a shape in the dark that is barely distinguishable from the surface of the water beside them. They are not waiting. They are not enduring. They have simply become what the night requires, still and small and folded, and they will unfold again when the light returns, not because they have been waiting for it, but because unfolding is what the light requires, and they move with what is required. You know how to do this. Your body knows before your mind does. Your body has been learning this since before you had a mind, has been practicing the art of the nightly surrender since the first time a brain complex enough to resist sleep found itself in the dark and chose not to resist. The choosing is very small. It is barely even a choice. It is more like a noticing that the resistance has become unnecessary, that the darkness is not what the resistance was protecting against, but is simply the darkness, the ordinary dark of the hours between the sun's setting and the sun's rising, the darkness that holds everything that needs holding until the morning. Let the morning hold itself for now. The morning is already prepared. It has been prepared with the same care and constancy with which every morning has been prepared since Amaterasu first stepped out of the cave and back into the sky. The preparations do not require your supervision. The light that will arrive with tomorrow's dawn is as inevitable as the light that arrived with this morning's dawn, and this morning's dawn was as inevitable as the one before it. And the chain of inevitability goes back through every morning to the morning of the cave, to the crack of gold in the sealed stone, to Tajikarau's hands on the rock, to Ame no Uzume dancing in the dark. Joy in the dark, curiosity at the cave's edge, light following curiosity. The pattern repeats, not because it must, but because it is the nature of light to follow the reaching toward, to enter through the crack that openness makes, to fill whatever space has been prepared for it with the thoroughness of water filling a vessel. Completely, without effort, occupying every available dimension of the space it is given. You are the vessel, the space you carry inside you, the space that opens as the resistance releases, as the weight of the day is set down, as the mind stops its moving and the body stops its holding. That space is available to be filled. The light has been filling it during the days, all the days, through every morning and every afternoon of your whole life. It is filling it now in a different way, in the dark way, in the way that preparation happens in the dark, quietly, without witness, in the deep and ordinary miracle of restoration. Breathe in. The air that enters your body right now has been breathed before, not by you, by everything, by the forests that breathe out what you breathe in, by the sea that exchanges its breath with the sky, by the mountains that hold cold air in their valleys and release it in the warmth of day. The air is shared. The breathing is collective. You are breathing right now in the company of everyone who has ever breathed, connected by the invisible continuous medium of air to every living thing that has filled its lungs since lungs were invented, since the world first learned how to exchange with itself. Breathe out. Give back what you borrowed. The giving back is as complete as the taking in. The breath does not hold on to you. The breath does not accumulate in you. It passes through, which is what it is for. What passes through you, the breath, the light, the days, the seasons. What passes through leaves no damage in the passing. The world that moves through you does not wear you out. You are designed for the passing through, built for the exchange, made from the same materials as the air and the water and the grain and the light. And in the dark hours, you remember this more clearly than in the busy illuminated hours, because in the dark, the complexity of things is simplified, and what remains is only what is essential. What is essential is very simple. You breathe. The sun is coming. The rice paddies are silver. The gods are in their places. The world below has been doing what it does. In the villages along the coast, the fishing boats sit on the sand with their hulls dark and wet from the day's work, and the fishermen sleep in the houses behind the boats, their hands still carrying the memory of rope and net and the weight of full baskets. The sea outside the village moves with its own agenda, its own rhythms negotiated with the moon, rather than with anything the fishermen require. The waves come in and run up the sand and pull back, come in and run up and pull back, and the sound of them is the sound that has been accompanying the sleep of coastal people since the first coastal people learned to sleep near the sea. It is one of the most complete sounds, a sound that comes from outside you, that you did not make, that continues without your participation, that fills the room of awareness so evenly that awareness slowly releases its grip on the edges and the center and everything in between, and allows itself to become part of the filling. In the mountain villages, the cold presses against the walls of the houses, and inside the walls, the warmth that people make, the warmth of their bodies, the banked coals, the weight of blankets, holds its own against the cold with the quiet tenacity of small warm things holding against large cold ones. It has always been this way in mountain villages. The warmth has always been enough. The walls have always held. The morning has always come with its light that reaches into the valleys late, held back by the ridgelines until the sun is well up, so that mountain mornings have a different quality from coastal mornings, darker longer, and then the light arriving all at once, definitive, flooding the valley from a sun already high. But that is the morning. That is tomorrow. Now is the part between. In the sacred mountain that overlooks the valley, where Ama no Iwato sits open and empty, there is a place where the water springs directly from the rock. Not a river fed from elsewhere, but water that has been moving through the mountain for a very long time, slowly, through the microscopic spaces between stone, and arrives at this place where the rock gives way and the water becomes visible for the first time. It emerges cold and clear and completely unhurried, falling a short distance into the small pool that has been worn into the rock below by centuries of its own falling, and then it moves away from the pool into a narrow channel that takes it down the mountain toward the valley. The sound of that small waterfall is one of the sounds that exists at the exact boundary of audible and inaudible, a sound so continuous and so quiet that it is as close to silence as sound can come without becoming silence. It is the sound of something that has been doing what it does for so long that it has ceased to be an event and has become a condition. Like the temperature of a room you've been sitting in long enough. Like the particular light of a place at a particular time of day that you know so well you stop seeing it and simply exist inside it. Exist inside the sound. The water falls, the water falls, the water falls. Each falling is the same falling, the same height, and the same arrival. And each one is different. Different drops, different path through the air, different particular moment of contact with the water in the pool, different ripple, the same and different, the same and different. This is how time moves in places that do not measure it, not in one direction only, but in both repeating and advancing, both familiar and new. The God who watches this waterfall, and there is a God for every significant water in the world, every spring and fall and confluence and source. The God who watches this waterfall has been watching it since it began, and what he has learned from this watching is patience of a depth that cannot be communicated in words, can only be approached through analogy, can only be felt at the edges by a person who sits very still for a very long time, next to something that has been going on since long before they arrived, and will be going on long after they leave. You can borrow some of that patience now. It is available. It is not guarded. The God who holds it has more than enough, has been accumulating it for millennia, and the accumulation does not deplete through sharing. Patience is one of the things that multiplies in the giving. Take some. Take as much as you need for the night, for the hour, for this moment, and the next, and the next. There is enough. There has always been enough. The cave mouth is open. The stone is moved. The light is coming. Sleep.